In 1999, the people of First Congregational Church of Hampton welcomed Rev Deborah Knowlton as their new pastor. Now, 21 glorious years later, we prepare to say farewell as she begins a well-earned retirement. We recently sat down with Rev Deb in her living room for a personal conversation of remembering and looking ahead to her new relaxing life in Maine.
Sunday mornings in my house growing up were always about church. And that was because my grandfather was a deacon, and he would get up and put his suspenders on and his white shirt and bow tie. My grandmother was the Sunday school superintendent, so she was rousting my sister and I out of bed early, and we dilly-dallied because it was Sunday, but we were putting our shoes and socks on in the back seat on the way to church to Exeter. My dad was out in the barn. He was the only one who didn't go early with all of us. And my mother, bless her heart, was always up early getting the baked potatoes washed and the chicken ready and the peas ready for Sunday dinner after we got home. And the minister knew that my dad didn't always make it with all of us. So when he did make it, the minister wanted to reward him for coming with everybody. And it was the days of the green stamp books that everybody collected when they went grocery shopping. So if Charlie came up to the back door of the sanctuary, saw Dad in the pew, he'd run down to his office, rush up with a book of green stamps. And as he processed down the aisle, he'd throw the green stamps in at Dad at the end of the pew with a wink, because Dad had made the effort to get there in the morning. So it was about church, but it was wonderful to be there together as a family. As I was growing up, I did belong to the youth group also at the church. And Exeter Congregational, in the days I was growing up, was a wonderful place for a young girl to go to youth group, because the Emerson School was a school for young men who were in 7th and 8th grade, and Phillips Exeter Academy was a high school aged group of young men. And both of those institutions had a must go to church policy. And so when I went to church as a young girl for youth group, the whole side of the sanctuary was full of young guys from the Emerson School and from Phillips Exeter, and a lot of them came back for youth group in the afternoon. So I didn't end up with a lot of dates out of that, but I ended up with a lot of really wonderful male companions as a young girl. And a couple of them who came from Britain or from, I think one was from Australia, came to our house for Thanksgiving. And that was great fun to have people from different parts of the world there for Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner as a result. But youth group was a wonderful world at the Exeter Church, growing up as a young girl in that town. In the youth group, although there were all these young men around that I was glad to have a gander at, I was very shy and very quiet and very bookish as a kid. And so I often took the officers' roles at church. I think for a lot of the time I was the secretary, and then I was the vice president for a while. So I actually enjoyed doing that because I could be part of the very small planning committee that would plan all the programs. But I wasn't real sociable in those days. The one occasion that I remember just feeling over the moon about when I came home was that we had a really good crew of young pastors, both male and female, who were Christian education people, and they often led the youth group. And there was a special dance that we had worked on planning. And I had worked so hard and put myself on all the committees so I wouldn't have to dance. But before the end of the evening, the male Christian education minister asked me if I wanted to dance with all the other kids. And that was a really wonderful special event for that years. I don't even know how I ever got into ministry being that shy, but that's what it was like when I was 9th through 12th grade. Maybe out of all those youth group days of being an officer, maybe out of all of those days when the whole family dragged me to church, I never really thought that I would become a pastor, but I knew that I loved church. And when I was a freshman in college, I was part of course I was an English Lit major, which a lot of ministers are. And I took a freshman English course. And there were 200 of us in that course up at UNH. And for purposes of getting anything done, other than the major lecture hall part of that course, they broke us into groups of 20 people or so. And each week we met as that 20 group of people. And each week we had a different question that we had to wrestle with as a group. And one week the question was, so how many of you believe in God? And I just quickly raised my hand, and then I looked around, and I was the only person in that 20-person group who had her hand up. And so I sort of put my hand down quickly. And then the instructor who was leading our 20-person group said, okay, how many of you would have believed in God in different circumstances? And then a whole lot more hands went up. And he said, what would have been those circumstances? And 2 or 3 people said, I think I would have believed in God if there had been an adult in my life who sat with me to answer some of my big questions, like, is there a God who created the world? And if so, what happens to that God when really hard things come along and I feel like that God is absent? And I remember us listening really intently to those people's responses, and I thought, I could be that person. I could get a master's degree in Christian education, and I could position myself in a way that when those questions come up, I would give people time to think through and talk through the answers. And I think that was my first time when I knew I wanted to do this. So over the years, after I first had that thought, I switched from Masters of Christian Education to Masters in Ministry and was ordained. And I had served 5 other churches before I saw that Hampton was open. And when I started at the Hampton Congregational Church, I listened for a long time to what people told me as I visited around and got to know people. And one of the things I really became aware of is why the search committee at Hampton had asked me if I would be willing to stay for a while. Because what people were telling me was that they had lived through a lot of what I would label as clergy churn, because for decades no one clergy had stayed longer than 4 years. So I remember thinking, oh, I could give them four years plus a little bit. And I decided, okay, I've stayed 7 years at most places up to now. I could definitely do 7. And 7 went by really quickly. And because the church nor I hadn't been together with each other for more than 7 years, at the 7-year point, I said to the boards and committees, so let's recovenant. And in my mind, I recovenanted for like 7 years. And we actually kind of verbally recovenanted with each other. So I was up to 14, but I never ever realized that spiritually, at 14, without really saying to each other, I realized we had covenanted for a little bit more. But here we are at 21, and it's been incredibly awesome to have been here that long. I just never thought that would be the case, but here we are, 3 times my usual amount with the church, and glad for it. In all the churches that I've served, there has been 1 or 2 memorable moments. And I'll just share 2 really quickly, as 2 that stand out for me. One is in the very first church that I served, and the scripture happened to be about how our body is our temple. And I didn't mean for this to be humorous at all, but I was trying to talk about how it's easy to let our bodies sort of be untended. And I talked about how it's easy for our bodies to become temples of ill repute. And I meant, not respected. But the minute I said that, there were sort of titters that began to go out in a wave amongst the congregation. And I thought, this isn't funny. Why are they laughing? So I just plowed on. And after church, the senior minister said, did you realize instead of ill-respected, you said ill-repute? I thought, oh, there was one of those moments. The other was in the Franklin church when my husband and I were co-pastoring, and he thought I filled the baptismal font, and I thought he filled the baptismal font. And it was an old wooden font that you had to ceremoniously take the cover off before you did the baptism. And we had gotten to the moment for the baptism. Everyone was standing there. We ceremoniously took the cover off, and both of us looked in and we thought, oh dear, nobody filled the baptismal font. So I looked at him and he looked at me, and since I was going to do the actual baptism, he said, we'll just have a moment where I go to the ceremonial faucet and fill the ceremonial pitcher and bring it back for the ceremonial baptism. So as he's going down the aisle in the back to the bathroom to fill the pitcher, the organist leans over and she says, let's all sing one verse of Shall We Gather at the River? So we sang the first verse and poured the water, and the baptism went on. But memorable all these years later. One of the things that I've done since I've been in the Hampton Congregational Church is to write a book. And it was a book that I didn't mean to write necessarily as a book. I just started looking for an interesting topic in the year of our 375th anniversary. And once I found the African Americans that had been members there and discovered that in the 1700s, 4% of the worshiping congregation were people of color, and less than 1% is a person of color today, I thought, there's a story here. And maybe I harkened back to my English Lit days and decided that would be a fun project. But after I wrote it, my dad was here living with me, and we had done a couple of trips that he wanted to do from his boyhood day, going back and visiting. And I realized that as a little boy, he had raised chickens right in his backyard. He had raised a little heifer in his backyard. And then summers, he had gone way out to western Massachusetts for several summers and worked as a farmer's helper. So that farming was in his blood, and the almost 35 years that he farmed the place that we lived on, he loved the history of it as much as he loved the farming of it. So people have asked me, would I write another book sometime? And I've actually done a tremendous amount of research for the farmhouse that I grew up in and where Dad farmed. And one of the links I never expected to discover was that Stephen Batchelor, who was the first pastor of the church that I've been serving, his grandson William was the first owner of the land that my dad eventually farmed. And so if I do another book someday, I think it might be the history of the farm and the land use over time, and just how the whole history of the farm changed with history itself. The introduction of mechanization, the introduction of, computers that could help figure out how many tons of silage would come off an acre, and all those things that my dad had been a part of. That might be book 2. Over the last 40 years, I've seen lots of changes in pastoral ministry. I think maybe the 2 greatest changes that I've seen have been, one, in the pastors themselves. When I started at Endeavor Newton Theological School, the class before me was a class of 60, and it had 8 women. And those 8 women had to be really good advocates for themselves, because they were the first to break into a primarily male-dominated profession. And when my class came along, there were 20 of us who were women. And they had already broken a whole lot of ground for us. But they never believed that we were quite activist enough. However, the men on campus thought we were more than enough activists, and they formed men's groups all over the campus to kind of retain their way of life that these women seemed to be invading. And so the first several positions that I was offered were not full positions as an ordained pastor. That didn't happen until my 3rd church, I think, because the whole population was still getting used to the woman as the preacher. And now I think that ratio has nearly flipped, and that probably more like 20 out of every 60 people that go to seminary now are men, and most everybody is a second career person instead of a first career person. So they bring a whole different skill set than we brought to ministry. I think that the other thing that's happened over those 40 years has unfortunately been the number of full-time churches just hugely has lowered. And way more people are coming out of that ordination process into a second career in their 50s and 60s for churches that are maybe 100 people or much less than that, rather than the church, for example, that I served in Connecticut that built an entire brick building for the 100 children that they had to teach every Sunday. So many more women, many fewer large churches in New England anyway, where I've done most of my ministry. So big changes over those 40 years. As I approach retirement, I've been thinking about what I would do with Sunday mornings, because I don't have a biological family that goes with me to church anymore since my dad's death. I have also gotten slightly out of practice of spending the entire morning doing church since COVID-19 has hit and we tape the services on Thursday. But there's something in me that has a feeling that as I retire, Sunday mornings are still going to be my Sabbath. And part of why I am excited about going to Bangor, the Bangor area in Maine, is that I looked ahead to what's up for churches there, and there are 2 United Church of Christ churches. Very different churches, one that has a little bit more social justice aspects to life together, one that looks a little bit more like Hampton, where there's a lot of engagement in church, but a lot more pastorally oriented than social justice oriented. And people who know Bangor or who have families in Bangor have told me the Unitarian Church there is really active in the area, doing special work for the poor and the disenfranchised. So it will be interesting to sit in the pew for the first time in more than 40 years and to try not to be too nitpicky about what happens, but just enjoy the ability to be ministered to. And I think it's going to be really different to speak only on behalf of Deborah and not know that I also have to keep in my mind that I'm speaking on behalf of a whole family of people that I love. So Sunday mornings are going to be different, no less sacred, but a little bit different, I think. As I think about my years at Hampton, I came into the church with what might sound like very small but broad expectations. When I interviewed 21 years ago, one of the messages that I received from the search committee that they may or may not have meant to give me, but what my spirit heard was, there have been 7 or 8 of us families that have felt like we've been running the church and keeping it going, and we're tired of doing that, and we'd like the opportunity to step back a little bit into the woodwork again. And so one of my first goals was maybe harking back to my years of liking to be in the background, but doing the sort of building and encouraging of other people. One of my goals was to build a really broad and deep tier of leadership in the church. And I feel like in many ways I've been able to accomplish that. And I can't take credit for that, but it really touches me that that's happened, because that's part of what my dad spent his whole life doing. Every new kid that came to the church, or came to the farm, that wanted a job, he didn't just think about giving them a job. He thought about, how can I make them a leader in their own way, doing the thing that they love? And so he paid a lot of attention to where they worked well, and he let them work there well to have a success. And then he moved them over into their avocation, into the area that was tough for them, and made them do that a little bit too, just to go strong in that. And as a kid, I didn't have words to describe that, but his work style sort of oozed into me, and it feels like that he's been my mentor in helping the church become broad and deep in its leadership. And for that, I thank the church and him. And I think if there was a second one close up under that, it would be that we still have a wonderful batch of kids. Because I love the kids at First Congregational Church. And I would just about turn myself inside out to make church a place where they felt welcomed, not as the future church, which I was told my whole life, oh, you kids, we have to keep you around, you're the future church. But as the now church, so that they could be leaders too. One of the things that I had to check out when I knew I was going to disengage from doing church a lot, the only other thing I do with all the passion that I have as a person, other than love my family, is to love the earth and to make sure I have a plot of land somewhere. So when I was interviewing the landlady where I'll live, whose name is Stanley, I saw from a photo that she had a beautiful little batch of flower garden underneath her bay window in the part of the structure where she and her husband live, next door to the apartment where I'll live. And I said to her, Stanley, is there any chance I could do a garden space under my window? And she said, glad you asked. I'll have my husband just get the rototiller out and there'll be a little plot under the window by the time you get here in October. And so I am so excited that I can start out with a little plot. And who knows, if I nudge her and we love each other, then maybe we'll see what we can grow together. One of the other things that I know that's going to change when I retire is that I won't have a whole bunch of people, family and or church family, that I am directly responsible for and have truly, truly loved tending. And that is going to be a very difficult shift for me, to be able to put myself in the mix as somebody who is always last at the bottom of the list to tend. And so I may actually take a month and not do much tending for anybody else and let my landlady and landlord drive me around Bangor so I have a chance to let them tend me for a little bit and show me the lay of the land. But I really hope for all their lives growing up as kids in a household where there were two pastors, our kids never complained when we got a call at a meal and one of us had to leave, when we were planning to drive out of the yard to go to a vacation, and there was one more thing that somebody needed us to do before we could get away to just be us. I think one of the things that I'm really going to relish is that I'll have two empty hands to tend my kids. And I actually asked permission from my kids, how close I could get as a hovering mother so that I wouldn't feel like I was always in their life. And Sarah responded by saying, "Oh, you would never be a hovering mother after I left you for 10 years and went to San Francisco." She said, "What I actually would like to do is I have at least 3 day trips planned already that you and I are going to need to do together. And Dan has already informed me that he's checked out that the Baltimore, Maryland International Airport has direct flights that go from Bangor Municipal Airport to Baltimore. So I feel like for the first time in my life, I can have lots of tending for my kids and tend my kids. And at almost 70 years old, that sounds really good."